So back then, obviously, like you said, there was a lot more gear involved. You were using hardware samplers, hardware keys.
250 kilos, I think we were when we first went overseas. It was nasty. It cost $1,000 to send the keyboard from Auckland to Nelson once on a plane. Well, it got freighted in the end, but it was $1,000.
Yeah.
That was horrible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, the technology as it's changed, has it been a case that, have you kind of found that the technology has driven things, or has it been a case that you've been looking for ways of doing things easier or quicker or lighter?
Very much that latter.
Yeah.
Our hardware rig peaked with using a Ensoniq TS12, which was a 76 note weighted action, piano action workstation synth, which is a pattern-based MIDI sequencer.
Yep.
And it was driving two samplers, an Akai S3200 and an Akai S6000, which was a terrible beast because it was never stable for the sort of first 3 years. So we had 8 outputs out of each sampler coming into a 24-channel mixing desk. We had 6 channels of effects stems, hardware effects. So we had 6 rack units.
Yeah, DP5, Roland DP5 effects unit.
Multi-effects.
A couple of small Boss.
Boss SE50s.
Boss SE50s, and then some little auxiliary sort of things, and then a compressor for doing the dubs and stuff.
And a pedal.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the peak of the hardware. Like it actually got so stupid that for a while we also, because what Mike's dubbing technique is to take perhaps what we really need things to be split out on multi-tracks, so that Mike can take one sound and he can push it to the fore and dub it individually rather than pull stuff out of a mix. All of them open at once. Yeah. So I got to the point where at one point we had 8 analog outputs out of each sampler, plus another 8 out of an ADAT light pipe that were then sort of going in. It was really complicated. We had sort of 8 outputs piggybacked through an ADAT interface, so that this 8 analog was actually presenting 16 outputs in its own. But anyway, that was, and then
we added
in 2002
we added live to that.
And then we started in 2002. Sort of Ableton Live came to our attention, and
thank God.
And it didn't even have MIDI at the time. It was audio. So what we did was we slaved it to MIDI clock. The TS12 was outputting MIDI clock, and we just had it slaving, and we were able to drop additional loops. And for a start, that was an amazing revelation because we'd come from purely sequencing MIDI, and all our production happened in the S3200, and we were MIDI sequencing all the parts. And then in 2000 we bought a G4 400 for the second album for Electronomicon, and that was a revelation. You can actually do lots of stuff in audio, manipulating files and cutting, pasting files, and making sounds in the audio world that you couldn't play, that MIDI played and things. And so that presented a problem in itself, which is why actually we got the S6000, because suddenly we had these really long constructed bits of audio that had to be played, as opposed to just one-note samples and things that. And so it used to be incredibly difficult to add new stuff to the set, because you'd have to take an audio file that we'd made in Logic, put it into the sampler, then make up a MIDI sequence to trigger the sampler, and then upload that sequence into the TS12. So it used to be just this most painful, long process to add new songs to the set. So when Live came along, suddenly you could just, it stayed as an audio file. You could start dropping it in, and so we sort of did that for about a year because it didn't have Live didn't have MIDI in it. We couldn't use it for MIDI sequencing the video show, which is what we had at the time.
The video development was running concurrently. By the time I met Paddy, I'd already moved to a computer-based. We had an Amiga 3000 back in 1990, which cost $3,000. Had a 20 meg hard drive. And we used to do full video shows off it. I don't know how now, looking back, I have no idea. It must have been 300 pixels high or something. But I worked with John Paul Sartre Experience and Headless Chickens and lots of the early raves. And so for the Chickens, we'd slave Bevan's drum kit to a MIDI, to his taking all his MIDI samples and slamming them out to the Amiga, and he would drum and would fire off all the stills, and we'd live jam that with other stuff. And eventually we found this program for the Amiga that had come out of America that enabled us to fire a MIDI note and trigger media. And then the programming guy who I met, I did the first Brain. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Brain parties. They were like raves. Well, the very first one, which was in K Road, I was all set up with my video stuff, and I was doing all this crazy feedback through Fairlight video effects units and all sorts of stuff, and kids were on this crazy pyramid they built in the middle of the dance floor. So yeah, there was actually people quite high, actually, quite intense. It must have been pre-osh.
Health and safety.
And this kid, well, he was a pretty young kid, 17 or 18, came up and he said, "Oh, wow, this is great. What computer are you using to do this?" I was like, "You can use a computer to do this?" It's like, we need to talk. Because it was all just analog feedback effects and just, tapes and loops. I mean, I'd never even thought that you could go out and take a computer out and go live. And so he was like, yeah. So we got together, similar to what Paddy and I did, and rave, and then suddenly it was like, there was a massive turnaround. Suddenly I could take all of that stuff and add the ability to use a computer to do video. And so we wrote a piece of software called Midio, which was very simple. It took an AVI file that might be 20,000 frames long.
You had a 1 gigabyte file size limit.
1 gig. Oh, okay. Oh,
I remember.
Can't remember that, but I had a great video card, a DC30 something or other, really fast, nice and accurate.
Yeah.
And it's always all analog out, no VGA or anything like that. And it would cut the frames up, so you'd have frame 1 to frame 25 for a 1 second loop would be a trigger, and then frame 26 to 2000 would be another, and then they could all have MIDI notes assigned to them. And we had these little SDF files that had to be completely correct or the whole thing wouldn't work, and so it was it was an interesting process. But we by the time I met Paddy, that had moved onto the PC, and we had I had a desktop which I used to take on as hand luggage on a plane. You sort of walk with this computer.
It's my laptop, you would say.
Eventually they'd get smaller, and I bought a flat screen monitor, which I think cost something ridiculous. A black and white flat screen monitor that cost $3,000. We had to put a card into the computer to be able to run it. And then the computers got smaller, and eventually we could get into hand luggage and sort of pretend as we went through customs that it was weighing, not weighing much. It was 28 kilos of hand luggage to travel, and so this whole thing is all now you're running around with your 15-inch PowerBooks and stuff, and it's doing everything. It's like it's been interesting watching that sort of thing, and I think there's some problems with that as well. And the thing we noticed is once we started looping audio, the MIDI had a life. There was a slippage that gave a groove, and it gave a there was a sense that it was easier, I think, to make groovy music digitally using MIDI.
It requires physical input. You're not building it on the page. It has to be played at some point, and that's been partially the challenge for us as we start to make more things out of audio or out of a chain of plugins and stuff. Okay, how do we deliver it live? And sort of in the sort of up to the 2002, 3, 4. That was we went through, I think, the Electronomicon sort of period show was when we'd first made a lot of stuff in audio, and it dipped from being, we just couldn't do it any other way than have a single MIDI note trigger a long sequence, a long phrase.